Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This life science focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to keep you up to date. And today's episode is sponsored by Gilson. Enjoy the show.
Looking for ways to automate your tedious lab tasks? Gilson can help. We automate sample dispensing and transfers so you can walk away and focus on your research. Choose from pre-configured systems or assemble your own to match your application. We blend in with your existing lab workflows so you can avoid reworking your already established procedures. Gilson can even support you with protocol development to speed up your time to automation. Go your own way with our scalable and precise robotic liquid handling systems. Head to go.gilson.com/xtalks to learn more or speak to an expert. That's go.gilson.com/xtalks.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Aisha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm joined by a very special guest on the show, Dr. Courtney Silverthorn, who is an Associate Vice President at the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, or FNIH, as well as the Director of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, or AMP program, including the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium. The FNIH recently announced that the AMP Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium has selected 8 rare diseases for its clinical trial portfolio. We will discuss the details of this with Dr. Silverthorn in this episode. So let's get right into it. Thank you very much for being on the show, Dr. Silverthorn. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So I just want to start off by asking you, could you tell us a bit more about the AMP Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, including when it was launched and what the key goals of the consortium are?
Absolutely. So the AMP Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium is part of the larger Accelerating Medicines Partnership Program. This is a very large set of public-private partnerships that date back originally to 2014 as a way for the NIH and the private sector to come together, share resources, share governance, and solve challenges in the pre-competitive space that neither the government or the private sector could solve on their own. The BGTC was the 6th area of AMP programs, and it's actually very unique in that it's the only AMP program that is focused on a therapeutic platform rather than a specific disease or disease area. Mm-hmm. So we launched the BGTC in October of 2021 with the goal of making the preclinical and regulatory processes for gene therapies more accessible for the rare disease patient population. Mm-hmm. We have components in the program that are related to research in AAV, or adeno-associated virus technology, as well as an end-to-end process of manufacturing preclinical testing and clinical trials for the 8 diseases that we've just selected.
Wonderful. And so can you tell us about the recent announcement about the consortium's new clinical trial portfolio, which includes 8 rare diseases? And what are those diseases that were selected and how were they chosen?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 8 rare diseases that were chosen and announced in May of 2022 are the result of about an 18-month review and selection process. Because the consortium is focused really on the pathway to an IND, or investigational new drug application for a rare disease indication, we were very open to the specific diseases that were included in the clinical trial portfolio because they're essentially proof of concept or test cases that we can provide a more streamlined pathway for the manufacturing processes for an AAV gene therapy, for the preclinical testing that's required to submit an IND application, and for the regulatory templates and submissions themselves. So shortly after the consortium launched, we put out an open call to the patient research clinical communities of the rare disease networks, asking them to submit diseases for us to consider for our clinical trial portfolio. We wanted this to be a very accessible process, so we put together a short nomination form. It's about 3 pages long that asked the submitters to provide some information about the rare disease or disorder, information about the patient population, how the disease affects that particular patient, any work that had been done in that disease previously, whether there had been animal studies or other preclinical testing already completed, and then some information that would help us enroll patients in an eventual clinical trial. So was there already a contact registry for that disease? Was there a patient advocacy group that could help us reach out to patients? From that initial call for nominations, we received 62 for us to consider. And we had a team of subject matter experts that reviewed those 62 disease nominations and selected a short list of 14 candidate diseases. Those 14 diseases were announced in July of 2022, and we requested clinical trial proposals for those 14 indications. From that interim list of 14, we did a review and scoring of the clinical trial proposals and ultimately selected the 8 diseases. One of the goals of the consortium is to make the work that we do as broadly applicable to as many diseases and disease spaces as possible. So we wanted to ultimately land on a portfolio that included different target tissues, different types of diseases, different AAV vectors. And so the final portfolio includes AAV5, AAV8, and AAV9. As well as achieving patient diversity across the clinical portfolio. And that was a little bit of an interesting discussion for us, because sometimes when you have these single gene diseases, the patient populations themselves can be pretty similar. And so we didn't necessarily require that an individual disease had to have a diverse patient population, but that as we were selecting the full portfolio, that across the totality of the patients that we had diversity. And we've managed to achieve all of those goals with the final selection. So the diseases that we selected, we classified into 3 different categories. So we have a set of ocular indications or eye disorders. We have a set of neurological indications. And then we also have a set of what we call systemic indications. So these could be target tissues throughout the body, but things that would be delivered to the entire body in the treatment. So within our ocular, our eye indications, we have one indication that is a corneal disease, so affecting the cornea in the eye, and that's congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy, or what we call CHED. We also have 2 retinal indications. One is a form of retinal degeneration that affects a particular gene in the retina, and one is a form of a disease called retinitis pigmentosa. And so each of these has a very specific gene that's not functioning properly in that particular disease and can cause blindness or vision challenges. In our neurological portfolio, we have 3 different diseases. One is a disease called multiple sulfatase deficiency. This is a disease that affects storage in the lysosomes, which is a specific type of cell within the body. And it produces a very, very rapidly progressing, very challenging disease for these patients. We have a disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, and again, a specific gene within that subset, causing progressive weakness in the body as the disease progresses. And then our third neurological disease is a form of spastic paraplegia that eventually causes loss of movement in the patient. And then finally, we have 2 systemic indications. One of these is a form of propionic acidemia. This is a disease that affects an enzyme that's produced in the body and can create some very life-threatening challenges to the patient because they don't have this functioning enzyme. And then the other one is called Morquio A syndrome, which is a skeletal disease causing very short stature, deformities in the limbs, and can also affect the teeth and the eyes as well. So you can see a very broad set of diseases, very broad set of tissues, all very rare diseases. We've estimated that across the entire portfolio of these 8 diseases in the United States, there's a total of maybe a little over 2,000 patients that are affected. So very small patient populations in the hundreds, 200s for each disease.
Wow. And so, yeah, speaking about the rare disease space, of course, here, how do you from a general overarching perspective, I mean, this clinical trial portfolio that you brought together, focusing on these rare diseases, but just in general in this space, in recent years, what kind of changes have you seen? Because if we spoke about rare diseases and drug development just maybe a decade or two ago, there wasn't really a lot of incentive. And for good reason from the pharmaceutical industry perspective. And we all know about all of those things. But now there's definitely, I'm seeing a great push towards developing treatments for rare diseases through initiatives like the Bespoke Consortium here. And so it's really wonderful to see. So what kind of changes have you seen being in this space and at the helm of an initiative like this? And where do you see things going in the future? I mean, in terms of the FDA has numerous pathways for rare disease indications or applications through different pathways, accelerated pathways and things like that. And we've been seeing a lot of gene therapy approvals in the past just like 1 or 2 years for rare diseases, which is really awesome to see. So what is your take on the current climate and where you see things going in the future in this space?
Yeah, the gene therapy space is exploding in terms of therapies. Right now, as of this recording, I think there are 2 gene therapies that are approved for rare diseases, but the FDA is expecting that number to grow substantially over the next 5 to 10 years. I think within the next decade, they're expecting 10 to 15 approvals per year.
Wow.
So just a lot of growth in this space, but a lot of it is focused towards larger patient populations. In the United States, a rare disease is defined as less than 200,000 patients.
Right.
And so some rare diseases can still have some pretty substantial patient populations that could be a viable pathway for a commercial entity to undertake through the normal drug development process. But for these very small patient populations, the normal processes of randomized controlled trials, of doing a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, they just don't really work as well when you only have 50 or 100 or 200 patients in total in the United States. And so while there are pathways within the FDA in terms of orphan drug status, in terms of accelerated approval, there's nothing that's really specifically targeted to gene therapies for rare diseases. And so that was a little bit of the problem that the BGTC was designed to overcome. We have heard from a recent survey of industry partners that half of them think that regulatory clarity is something that this field needs more than anything else. The second highest is manufacturing. That's a whole different ballgame. But we set out to really use the clinical trials in the BGTC to help make a more clear regulatory pathway, particularly for these very small patient populations that maybe only need an IND and a phase 1 clinical trial to treat every patient in the United States with that particular disease. There have been some isolated success stories of very determined parents who have a child with a rare disease and have set out to fundraise and work with clinicians and work with researchers and $10 or $20 or $50 at a time, assemble enough funds to create a gene therapy treatment just for their child, or maybe a handful of children. It's not something that goes all the way through the FDA approval process, but it's enough to get their child treated. But they have found the process of doing that very challenging, very unclear, kind of having to figure out the roadmap along the way on their own, become regulatory experts, become manufacturing experts, become clinical trial experts. And we really wanted to provide an opportunity for not just the 8 diseases that we will move forward in our clinical trials, but really use that to create a pathway that any gene therapy for a rare disease can follow. Developing minimum sets of manufacturing standards so that you're doing everything that you need to do in order to show that your manufactured product is safe, but you're not doing unnecessary testing. Similarly, we are working on sets of preclinical testing standards. What is the minimum set of preclinical tests in an animal model that you need to do to show that something is safe enough to give it to a human being? And the gold standard, of course, is primate models. Primate models are very expensive. And in some cases, they might not be needed. A less expensive animal model might be a sufficient substitute, and that can get you to your preclinical testing in a faster and a less expensive way. And so really what we want to make sure is that when these parents are working with nonprofit foundations, when they're fundraising on their own, that every dollar that they raise is really being used to do exactly what's needed and nothing more to get into a phase 1 trial.
Excellent insights, and just bringing clarity to the clarity that is needed within this phase from a regulatory perspective. That's thank you so much for shedding light on that. And of course, since 80% of rare diseases have a genetic basis, gene therapy is, of course, at the forefront of treatments for many of these diseases. And so within the gene therapy space, what do you see as being the current climate? I mean, in the past couple of decades, the whole, there's been so many challenges to get gene therapies, to develop them so that they're safe and effective in patients. And now we're finally seeing so many approvals coming through for rare and other diseases as well. And I know that, so the BGTC is currently focusing on AAV, so adeno-associated vectors, as delivery vectors for these gene therapies. Are there other, vectors and under development, say nanoparticles and things like that, or is the focus on AAV, and why AAV? And also, where do you see the gene therapy space in general going in the future?
Yeah, so the BGTC is focused exclusively on AAV gene therapy, and even more specifically, AAV gene replacement. So I know that gene editing is a very hot field of technologies, but we wanted to choose a very specific pathway that we could repeat over and over again, so that others could continue to repeat that over and over again. And so we chose AAV gene therapy because, one, it's the most used in the field so far. It has the most well-tested safety profile, but also it offered us the most freedom to operate in a pre-competitive space. So we're using wild-type AAV vectors, no novel capsids, no novel delivery technologies, really wanting to ensure that the work that we do is as accessible to the general population as possible. We know that the field is developing rapidly, that new technologies are coming forward, and all of those original AMP programs that started back in 2014 have continued or expanded into broader applications. And I think that there's going to be a lot of expectation that the BGTC will continue or expand beyond we're currently structured through 2027. And I think that could look a couple different ways. It might be additional work in AAV gene therapy. We have some side research within the consortium that is working on a more platform-based process for manufacturing gene therapies. And so that might be the basis of continuing work in AAV gene therapy in a second phase of the BGTC. It could be replicating the work of the BGTC, the preclinical manufacturing regulatory, in a different delivery technology, whether that's another viral technology like lentivirus or a non-viral technology like nanoparticles, lipid nanoparticles, or in gene editing, if that field develops sufficiently over the next several years. Or we could be looking at trying to answer a research or a regulatory question that we can't even anticipate at this time, but given how fast the field is moving, by the time we get to the end of the consortium in 2027, it could be an entirely different landscape. And that's really exciting to think about what the possibilities could be there.
Absolutely. And so what are the future goals of the BGTC? Where does the consortium go from here, and what can we expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So our next big step is to secure our manufacturing commitments. So all of the vector product for the 8 clinical trials that the BGTC will run will be manufactured by either existing BGTC partners or a short list of contract manufacturing organizations that we've pre-vetted in terms of their capabilities to meet the needs of the consortium. So that's what we're currently in the process of doing. And here, what we're trying to ensure that we do is that we leverage prior work of these organizations as much as possible. So if they've already manufactured a product for a particular AAV type or a particular route of administration, we want to leverage that previous work as reference material as much as possible rather than reinventing the wheel for every clinical trial. We'll also be assembling what we're calling cross-functional teams within the consortium. So previously, for the first 18 months of the consortium, we were structured very functionally around manufacturing, around clinical trials, around regulatory aspects. But now that we have our 8 diseases selected, we'll actually be putting together teams that draw across the entirety of that subject matter expertise focused on each one of the individual 8 diseases. And so these teams will include a representative from the manufacturer who's making the product for that particular disease clinical trial. It will include subject matter experts from the body of the consortium partners, the PI of the clinical trial, as well as representation from the patient advocates or patient groups themselves, so that as we move forward towards the actual clinical trial, we're getting the voice of the patient into our work very early on. We will be doing the manufacturing and the preclinical testing according to those consensus protocols that we're developing for the clinical trial set over about the next year or so. And we're hoping to file our IND applications for these 8 clinical trials in the first half of 2024, hoping for a speedy review and approval of those, and then beginning to enroll patients in the clinical trial mid to late 2024. One of the criteria that we required for the consideration of the diseases and disorders was that a clinical endpoint had to be known as well as measurable within about the first 12 to 18 months. And so we would expect that in addition to collecting all the safety data that you would normally collect in a phase 1 trial, that we would be able to have a measurable clinical endpoint pretty much end of 2026, before the end of the consortium in 2027.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so the message that we're trying to ensure that everyone hears about the work of the consortium is that it's not just about these 8 diseases.
Yeah.
While we hope that we will have 8 successful clinical trials, we hope that we will successfully treat 60 to 70 patients in those clinical trials. If that was the only thing that we did, we wouldn't fully consider the consortium a success, because it's really about using those clinical trials to ensure that others have the processes, the directions, the templates, the materials to move their own indications forward. And so beyond just the 60 or 70 patients that we'll have in these clinical trials, we really hope that the BGTC is transformative for hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of patients in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Silverthorn, for your time today to be on the show. It was such an insightful conversation and discussion. So thank you so much, and I greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you like today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media, email podcast@xtalks.com, or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.